International Organization for Migration, IOM for short, Displacement Tracking Matrix report. This conversation is being hosted by the Trade and Economic Development Unit, TEDU for short, at the University of the West Indies. For some time, the TEDU has been using its national conversation platform as a forum to facilitate engagement between experts on the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. The objective of these conversations is to ensure that the public is informed of critical information on and analysis of the economy in a timely manner. At this point, I'd like to invite Ms. Jewel Ali to give us an overview of the IOM and their work with Divided Women migrants in Trinidad and Tobago. Ms. Ali.
Thank you, Chair, Mr. Sidi. Distinguished panelists, Dr. Tuari, Dr. Hussein, Dr. Gonzales, Mr. Walcott, and of course, Ms. Leanne Wardrop-Bonet. Participants, good evening, and thank you for inviting the International Organization for Migration to present the 2020 findings of the Displacement Tracking Matrix, as well as provide an analysis on how the migration outlook in Trinidad and Tobago has changed over the course of the year. This research is timely, and research and timely collection of data surrounding migration is instrumental to the work of IOM, and understanding migration and mobility trends are now more important than ever. The DTM will continue to be an invaluable tool as we seek to respond to the evolving needs of migrants and contribute to finding practical solutions suitable to the local context. Over the last 15 years, IOM Port of Spain has worked very closely with the government stakeholders to strengthen its national capacity to respond to issues of migration. IOM assisted in the development and review of migration-related policies and legislation, including, but not limited to, the Immigration Act and Regulations, the Trafficking in Persons Act, Foreign Labor Act, Employment Exchange Act, and the Recruitment of Workers Act. IOM also delivers direct emergency assistance to vulnerable migrants, refugees, victims of trafficking, and even host community. Our services include case management, mental health and psychosocial support, the provision of food, hygiene and cleaning items, and other basic necessities, life-saving information, and short-term accommodation. IOM has also embarked on vocational training in collaboration with its partners to empower migrants, particularly vulnerable women. IOM's programming activities are carefully informed by data generated through research and data collection tools, such as the Displacement Tracking Matrix. It is used in conjunction with other data collection tools, such as beneficiary needs assessment and vocational training assessments. In closing, I would like to express my anticipation for engaging in further discussions on the topic and to future collaboration with the University of the West Indies, with the overall goal of improving the lives of everyone affected by migration in Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ali, for that overview. To our audience, on this evening's panel, we have Ms. Leanne Wardrop-Bonet, our lead presenter. She is a research consultant at the IOM, UN Migration. Next, we have Dr. Roger Hussein, senior economist at the University of the West Indies and the coordinator of TEDU. Dr. Anthony Gonzales, retired director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies. Mr. Eric Walcott, head of strategic partnerships at the Institute of Caribbean Studies in Washington, DC, and Dr. Nyla Lyons, a contributor at the Institute of Caribbean Studies in DC as well. Just a couple of meeting announcements, everyone. Please ensure that your microphones are muted when you're not speaking to prevent feedback. And please note that this session is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. This evening's conversation will proceed as follows. We will begin with a presentation by Ms. Wardrop-Bonet. followed by contributions from Dr. Hussein, Dr. Gonzales, Mr. Walcott, and Dr. Lyons. And last but not least, we'll invite questions and comments from you, our audience, either verbally or using the Zoom chat box. Thank you. Now I'd just like to invite Ms. Waldrop-Bonner to begin her presentation.
Okay, thanks so much, Christian. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for this opportunity to present the findings of the DTM 2020 against the findings of the DTM 2019. As Jewel indicated, IOM also engages in other migrant assessments. However, for this evening, we'll focus primarily on the DTM, and I will give you just a snapshot of what obtained in the other assessments that IOM conducted over the course of 2020. So I'll begin my presentation. And to start, DTM is essentially a tracking matrix. It's called the Displacement Tracking Matrix. And this exercise is funded by the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, U.S. State Department. The DTM, therefore, is managed by IOM Port of Spain within the framework of the Regional Refugee and Migrant Response. Hence, DTM is essentially a system to monitor displacement and population movements. It offers, therefore, a better understanding of the movements and evolving needs of mobile populations in places of displacement. This type of exercise has been around since 2004, and it has been conducted in 72 countries and has been able to track over 30 million individuals. So what happened in DTM 2020 opposed to 2019? We begin with an overview of the sample size, and we note that in 2019, there were 2,166 Venezuelan migrants participating in the exercise. However, in 2020, given the situation of COVID-19, we had a much reduced sample size of 950 Venezuelan migrants. And when we go to our methodology, we see that interviews and surveys were utilized in both exercises. However, for DTM 2019, we employed face-to-face interviews. But as I indicated, because of COVID-19 and mobility restrictions, we conducted telephone interviews for DTM 2020. Given the nature of these interviews, we therefore had to condense our questionnaire instrument to avoid interviewer as well as respondent fatigue. Therefore, the sampling strategy for this exercise was a snowball sampling approach, which is considered to be ideal given the hard-to-reach population that we were trying to access. However, it must be noted that non-probability samples cannot be relied on to draw conclusions or make inferences on the entire migrant population. Rather, it gives information on the sample that was captured. So as we review the main findings, we note first off, in terms of the demographic location, the geographical spread, we're seeing in 2019, the Pinal Debe, Siparia areas, as well as Cuba, Talparo, Tabaquite, Arima, Tunapuna had high numbers of respondents in those areas. However, in DTM 2020, we notice the Arima area, Chaguanas, Cuba, Talparo, Tunapuna to a lesser extent, as well as San Fernando having higher numbers of respondents, but we're seeing smaller numbers of respondents in Siparia and Pinal Debe. And of course, I must mention that the respondents for DTM 2020 were informed by IOM's existing database, the baseline interviews, as well as key stakeholder referrals. So that's how we accessed our population in 2020. Additionally, when we break down our respondents by sex, we note that in 2019, there were more male respondents, whereas in 2020, there were a higher number of female respondents. We also examined sex by age, and we saw some similarities relative to the age group of the respondents, but we note that in 2019, the 25 to 29 category had the highest number of respondents, whereas in 2020, we're seeing the 30 to 34 category having a higher number of respondents. Additionally, marital status also came under the migrant profiles. And interestingly, we note that in 2019, there was a clear majority of single persons within the respondents. But when we look at our 2020 data, we're seeing just marginal differences between the single persons and the married persons. Completed education, and I must state that this is very different because we captured incomplete as well as completed education. And this graph looks at completed education, and we note that in 2019, there were a number of respondents who completed secondary level education. However, in 2020, we're seeing the less than 24 category having a high number of persons who completed secondary education. But as we progress throughout the other age groups, we're seeing that there were reported cases of more persons with university level education. I must note, however, based on our interviews with authorities and other key stakeholders, it was stated that this finding varied to the national registration exercise information that was captured during that exercise in June 2019. Regarding pregnant female interviewees, we see that there was a 2% decrease between 2019 DTM and 2020 DTM as it pertains to pregnant female interviewees. We're also seeing that baseline interviews refer to mounting numbers of pregnant female migrants, and this is certainly something we need to be aware of, especially policymakers and in planning our programs for migrants. Here we examined the time in Trinidad and Tobago. And this is a key finding here. We're seeing that in 2019, it was less than a quarter of the respondents were in Trinidad for a period of more than 12 months. But we're seeing in 2020, we have 88% of the respondents being in Trinidad for more than 12 months. So many of the persons we interviewed were persons who would have been here at least for a year. Government registration, and this is a very topical area. We're seeing not much difference between the 2019 and 2020 findings, and we note that the largest category of registrants were refugees and asylum seekers in both years, and this is something interesting to note. And an examination of routes showed that there were not significant variations between the 2 years, as we're seeing the preferred mode of entering Trinidad was via boat in both years. Likewise, with regard to the entry points, we're noting that in 2019, 70% of the migrants entered through unofficial entry points. Whereas in 2020, we're seeing 42% of the migrants entered through unofficial entry points. Once again, there was a conflict based on the interviews with key stakeholders who noted an escalation in irregular entries amongst the Venezuelan nationals, especially after the introduction of visa requirements for Venezuelan nationals from June 2019 and the closure of national borders in March 2020. So there's a bit of a conflict there in terms of the findings, in terms of what is reported by the respondents and the information we got from the baseline interviews. Quite interesting to note was that 52% of the respondents planned to return to Venezuela. However, they didn't know when they would do so. Employment was a key area of the DTM exercise. And we note here that in 2019, there was an increase in unemployment, and we're seeing that also in 2020. But what's interesting to note here is that the employment figures for 2019, we're seeing an increase in employment during the post-migration period, However, in 2020, we're seeing a decrease in employment during the post-migration period. And these are very, very notable findings indeed. Also within the employment sector, and as I indicated, the questionnaire for DTM 2019 varied a bit to 2020 because we included some additional sections whilst contracting the instrument a bit. So in 2019, we looked at the before and after work sector. In 2020, we looked at the after or post-migration work sector. And we note that the construction sector, the highest number of our respondents were employed in the construction sector, followed by the tourism, hospitality, and entertainment sectors, and then commerce. In employment as well, we're seeing in DTM 2019 a drop as opposed to in the number of employees who were, the number of persons, interviews who were employed in the informal sector. So we're seeing 60% of the persons employed in the informal sector, but in 2020, we're seeing a reduction of the informal sector in terms of 46% of the interviewees being there. So this is definitely a positive finding, which may have been impacted by the registration exercise, as a lot of persons were registered and would have been able to therefore access legitimate work employment and options. We're also, however, seeing an increase in the number of underpaid employed persons. And this is a concerning finding because whilst there's a shift from the informal sector, there is an emergent trend amongst the interviewees in the area of underpayment. Protection was an area that was included specifically in DTM 2020. And here we noted that 47% of the migrants knew someone in their migrant community who worked without receiving the agreed payment. And from the chart, we note that 62% of these activities occurred in the construction sector. Moreover, 8% of the respondents knew someone in their migrant community who was forced to work or perform other activities against their will. And once again, we're seeing that these activities occurred in the construction sector, tourism, hospitality, and entertainment sector, and in sex work. Additionally, 25% of the respondents witnessed physical and sexual violence during their time in Trinidad and Tobago. Yet, by the same token, we're seeing an interesting change here, as there was an 11% decrease in the number of respondents who felt discriminated against because of their nationality. Pardon me. So this is certainly something that is a positive change and a positive finding. Also, dependence was an area that we looked at in DTM 2019 and DTM 2020. And we're seeing some interesting changes here. In 2019, we note that 54% of the persons had dependents only in their home country, which was Venezuela. However, in DTM 2020, we're seeing an increase in the number of persons with dependents, both in Venezuela and Trinidad. Moreover, the persons with dependents only in Venezuela, there was a deduction or decrease, pardon me. There was a deduction or a decrease in the number of persons with dependents only in Venezuela in 2020. Excuse me. Accommodation-wise, we're seeing in DTM 2019 similar trends to 2020, whereby persons with dependents in Trinidad and Tobago were leasing a room, and that is a very concerning trend as well as it pertains to the spaciousness, pardon me, the spaciousness as well as the comfort of their dwelling, as well as the privacy options available to persons in these accommodations. Children was also a new team to DTM 2020, and we see that 65% of the respondents lived with 1,216 children. Please excuse me 1 second. I think I need a sip of water. Okay, apologies for that. Much better. So we're seeing that 65% of the respondents in DTM 2020 lived with 1,216 children. Here we note that the 0 to 4 category had the largest number of children, and that is something we need to pay particular attention to as it pertains to the services and options available to these children within Trinidad and Tobago of Venezuelan migrants. Additionally, 13% of the respondents were aware of children born in Trinidad and Tobago to Venezuelan migrants who did not have a birth certificate. And that is something as it pertains to understanding exactly who are in your country, individuals in your country, and planning for these individuals. It would have consequences and impacts for that. Moreover, the baseline interviews highlighted an increase in unaccompanied minors. Children education, however, was captured in both DTM 2019 and DTM 2020. But we're seeing some positive changes here, as in DTM 2019, 90% of the persons with children of school age did not have access to formal education, whereas in DTM 2020, we're seeing that 59% of the children residing with respondents did not have access to education. Moreover, DTM 2020 pointed out that the main reasons for this inaccessibility was due to lack of documents and cost. Regarding health now, we note that 71% of the respondents who accessed health services in DTM 2020 used the public hospital services. However, there is a trend whereby we're seeing in DTM 2019, 83% of the respondents did not have access to reproductive and sexual health services. And in DTM 2020, we find similar data whereby 84% of the respondents did not have access to these services. Moreover, there is a decrease in the number of pregnant women who did not access prenatal services between the 2 years. So that is a positive trend. However, by the same token, we noted that 27% of the respondents did not know where to obtain information about health services. And that is certainly an information gap that we need to address moving forward. COVID-19 has been a major challenge to many countries, and likewise, migrants encountered a number of difficulties. And we note that 60% of the interviewees experienced difficulties with the start of COVID-19, whereby the worsened quality of food was the most pressing issue. Additionally, 68% of the unemployed respondents lost their jobs due to the pandemic, based on the reports we got from DTM 2020. It is interesting to note that 55% of the respondents received support during the COVID-19 pandemic, and 81% of the support came from religious and international organizations. The chart we're seeing here also details some additional difficulties, and we're seeing not having a place to sleep, discrimination, and unemployment as being some additional challenges encountered by migrants. Regarding the needs, we're seeing comparable needs between DTM 2019 and DTM 2020. Okay, so that was a a wrap-up of DTM 2019 against DTM 2020. As I indicated earlier, IOM conducted other migrant assessments, and these migrant assessments were conducted in collaboration with UN Women. And they were done in Trinidad and Tobago, Aruba, and Curacao. The main objective of this project, therefore, was to promote and strengthen livelihoods, economic empowerment, and safety for female Venezuelan migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, as well as host country women. The methodology was similar to DTM exercises, whereby it was a purposive sampling strategy, and we administered a survey instrument to 1,316 vulnerable persons between August and December 2020. And what did we find? First off, beneficiary needs assessments were conducted, and this indicated that 31% of the respondents had culinary cooking skills, whilst 13% had skills in tourism, entertainment, and hospitality, and 12% had retail, trade, and sales skills. We also identified that the majority of the respondents entered Trinidad in 2019. Regarding their living conditions, we note that living conditions were more or less amenable. However, we're seeing some issues in terms of the cleanliness of the conditions. We're also seeing some space challenges and some safety challenges. Alternatively, vocational training assessments were conducted, and these assessments highlighted English language proficiency challenges amongst the respondents. We're seeing that the majority of interviewees did not have any beginner's level English language proficiency for all key areas. And we're also noting that approximately 15% had not attained any capabilities in the language at all. Moreover, the top courses that the interviewees were interested in were entrepreneurship, and of course, given the English language deficiencies, they were also interested in English classes, and sales and marketing. Those were just the top 3 ones. Moreover, many of them had access to a device that could support learning. However, there were some participation challenges, as many of them indicated that they had household responsibilities and childcare obligations. Therefore, in sum, the DTM and other migrant assessments could inform programs and policies on migrant initiatives. The DTM 2020 showed a noticeable contraction of local employment opportunities in the wake of COVID-19. And there were also increased instances of employer underpayment. Moreover, there was a trust towards family migration and family reunification amongst the Venezuelan migrant population, which ultimately expanded the housing and food needs of the migrants. Apart from this, it was noted that the educational needs of children cannot be ignored, and there was greater need for efforts in the area of reproductive and sexual health services. Apart from this, information gaps should be addressed. On the other hand, the vocational training assessment, these findings could contribute to improved economic opportunities and sustainable livelihoods for vulnerable populations. It was also highlighted that despite the respondents' educational levels, they were unemployed. However, there was significant interest in skills training, but this could only be conducted and be successful if there are language classes that are given or imparted to them prior to their training or integrated within their skills courses. Therefore, the constantly evolving migrant situation should be continuously analyzed to inform programmatic and policy initiatives and ensure that the existing needs are adequately met. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Ms. Waldrop on there. Very rich data. Thank you very much. Now we'd just like to invite Dr. Hussein to give his contribution. Dr. Hussein.
Thank you very much. Are you all hearing me, Christian?
Yes, loud and clear.
So I would like to thank the IOM and Leanne and Joel in particular for that presentation. It is what the public is starved of, data, and we appreciate it deeply. I saw quite a few useful blocks of data within the presentation that I would draw reference to as we move along. So rather than do a presentation, I have a few questions for Leanne and Joel. I will list them out and they could perhaps write them down and respond to them one by one, or I don't know, we could work out how she would like me to refer to them. The first one is, are we dealing with refugees, immigrants, or asylum seekers? How do we specifically distinguish between these various groups of people? The second one is, in the 2020 study, we used less than half the number of people of the 2019 study. And that therefore has me a little concerned as to how reliable, I know both are non-probability samples, but how reliable the 2020 information is in relation to the 2019 information, and perhaps Leanne could comment on that. The fourth thing we are noticing is that people are now seemingly bringing their families, and that probably points, so you are seeing less single people, and it probably points to an intention to stay here, perhaps for a longer term period of time, and policymakers will have to take good note of that. Now, there are several inconsistencies I picked up in the presentation. So in one point, we are seeing data with a lot of highly educated migrants. Christian, are you all hearing me?
Yes, Dr.
Right.
Hussein.
And the fact that there are so many highly educated migrants in terms of the data that Leanne presented points to the need that we need to have a greater focus on registering these people. We need to understand what are their skills, and therefore, in my judgment, I think we should be doing a full registration of all the migrants that are here. Now, the mounting number of pregnant females are a concern, because these people are being, some people, we will now have a situation where there are newborn children in the Trinidad and Tobago economy. And as far as I am aware, if you are born here, you are a Trinidad and Tobago national and you have privileges. So I would like to hear if the IOM has an opinion as to the implications of the mounting number of pregnant females. And in 2020, I see that one of the slides that Leanne had up, and she did mention it was odd, is that 42% of people who come here via unofficial or illegal means, as compared to a much larger number before. But how will the number fall if it is the borders are closed? And if it is we have a visa implications, a visa requirement in place? 52% plan to return to Venezuela. Now that I find that strange, because 52% plan to return to Venezuela, yet still we are seeing more people bringing their families in the 2020 survey as compared to the 2019. And that's something that the policymakers would have to look at. Now, one of the things that concern me a bit about the data is that we are seeing unemployment rates on the rise. But my suspicion, Leanne and Joel, is that unemployment rate in the formal sector is on the rise. And people are not declaring their employment status if they are undocumented or illegally here. And therefore, we may have a rise in informal sector employment, and people are simply not going to give you that kind of data because they are breaking the law if they are here illegally and working, in my opinion. Then one of these slides specifically said that there is a decrease in informal sector employment. I don't know if you can elaborate on that a little bit, Leanne, because I myself am not clear about that. And in one of your final slides on the children, I couldn't pick up the slide number, so I can't really refer to it. In one of these slides, 41% had accessibility problems for their children to educate in terms of education. But we didn't open up the educational sector to these Venezuelans. So how then do we have a situation of less people having problems to access education? Now, you may not be able to respond to any of these questions, and fair enough, you may be able to respond to all, and that would be welcome. But what we deeply appreciate is the block information that you are putting in the public domain. What we hope is that the next time you do this survey in 2021, that it maintains the consistency with the 2020 version, which we understand you had to truncate because of the COVID-19 problem. And what is really deeply needed, in my judgment, and probably Professor Gonzales will comment as well, is what are the implications for the labor market and for trade. Now, I couldn't pick up much trade-related input and data from the document, except the informal employment status. I picked up one or two things that could be used to help with the labor market. I certainly don't think the unemployment rate is on the rise amongst the Venezuelans, but I have to go with what your data says. And so I think that this is a tremendous addition to the body of material out there. IOM should be congratulated, and we look forward, certainly as at the university, where we can, to partner with you, because in my judgment, this is the only factor boom on the horizon for the present. I looked at the growth performance of the Trinidad and Tobago economy this morning for 23, 24, 25, and 26. And in each year, we are ranked in the top worst forecasted, 30 worst forecasted growth performance for those years. Now, this means that a spark to the economy has to come from somewhere. And if it is that the natural gas sector, via the failure of Broadside, which BHP Billiton drilled, is unable to provide that big push forward, then the only other factor of production that I see with some promise is the labor market. And therefore, having data and interacting this data with the implications for the Trinidad and Tobago economy, both macroeconomic and sectoral market perspective, is of critical importance if we, the technocrats, are to provide some basic guidelines, and mind you, nobody may listen at all, some basic guidelines as to how we could use this collected data to influence or to make suggestions to policymakers that may be of use. So I will stop there. I raise my questions. If you want me to repeat any or tie them out, I can. But thank you very much for what I consider to be a very useful block of survey material. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussein. Next, we'd just like to invite Professor Gonzales to give his contribution.
Yes, thank you very much, Christian. And let me begin by thanking the IOM and Leanne for this presentation. As I said earlier, or the last time I did my presentation, we seriously lack data to do a lot of the analysis that we'd like to do. And this is a welcome input into our ability to understand what is happening on the ground. Let me be very brief because I think Roger said quite a bit of what I wanted to say. I will start first of all with the question of methodology. The survey or the presentation indicated that they used a snowballing method, which, as we know in the literature, would suggest that this is not random based, and as such, you cannot draw very much from it. My concern is basically, if it is very difficult to get a proper sampling frame, then is it possible to use the snowballing method in such a way that you eliminate bias? That is to say, bias is usually introduced in a snowballing method if the first person leads to the last person. But if you are able to break the links between the first and the last person, it's quite possible that you could get non-bias in the responses. So that I think we may need to probably look at that and see to what extent it may allow us to make some proper deductions from the survey. And I would think that there is some kind of registered list of Venezuelans here. There's the government list. I don't know if you have access to that. I know UNHCR has its own list of registered Venezuelans, and that list may be available from which to draw up some kind of sample. But moving on, there's a problem here also in terms of the stratification of the surveys. We see a kind of geographical distribution across the country, and Leanne herself mentioned that there was, particularly in the second survey, some kind of reduction in the representation of those in the South. I looked at it, and both the North and the South, to me, the North and the South of Trinidad seem to be somewhat underrepresented in the second survey. So that I would think we need to have some better idea as to how they are geographically located and how to do a better representation of all the various groups throughout the country. Now, having said this about the methodology, it is clear that we have a problem in making the comparisons between the two surveys. It is almost as though you're dealing with two different populations, and as I think IOM itself has said, we cannot draw anything about the population. The most we can say is about that particular sample of 1,000 or 2,000, as in the first case. We can say something about that, but we can't say nothing very much about the two about the entire population of Venezuelans here. And really, our interest is really to try and say something about the entire population of the Venezuelans here. But as we go along, and Roger pointed out a number of these cases where you find a significant amount of inconsistencies. You find, for instance, that there is a drastic changes, for example, in the distribution by sex, for example. You know, a marked increase in females by 17% in 1 year. So from 2019 to 2020, there's a 17% increase in females over males. Now that is a pretty drastic change, and I'm trying to understand why that is so. I mean, normally in that society, as you see, as occurred in the early phase, males go out first and they try to establish themselves, and then they bring females and children. But you see a significant increase, and I'm not clear in my mind why that is so. We see this in terms of the sex and age distribution as well. You find that there's a female dominance in all the categories in 2020 as compared to 2019. I think there was in 2019 to some extent there was male dominance in I think one or two of the categories. So again, here probably we need to try to understand what is happening there. As I said, it might have just to do with the representation of these samples. We pointed out, we discussed the question of the increase of married persons as compared to single persons. Again, here you have had a significant change. with my people increasing by 13%, or roughly around there. And again, I would think we have to try to figure out what is really behind that. For instance, I noted that there was some, in terms of, let's say, was a pregnant woman, there was a change in the age groups being used, for instance. One was from 18 to 21 in 2019, and the other one was from 18 to 25 in the second survey in 2020. So I don't know if it's that change in definition of age groups that may have, to some extent, caused some of this. But we need to look at that to really get a clearer understanding in terms of grasping what is happening at the level of the entire Venezuelan migrant population in the country. Now, yes, we looked at several areas where you find that, and to some extent I did this in my last presentation, you know, things like employment, health, education, and so forth. And we saw, made a number of very interesting observations there. I hope some of them are really representative and could point us to really making serious policy here. But let me say that the idea that there are more people in 2020, I think it was 88% in 2020 that said that they were here for more than 12 months, as compared to 23% in 2019. Now, I'm having difficulty here because there seems to be some kind of aberration if you look at the entire population of Venezuelans here. That's quite a drastic change in attitude, or at least in terms of the numbers who say they're here for a longer period. Again, I don't know what is explaining that, and I really didn't have any kind of ability to really understand it. I think we can probably discuss this further and see if we could throw some light in this. There was also some difference in registration. We find that, for instance, it wasn't very significant. You had about 80% of the people interviewed were registered in 2019, or 80% in 2020, as compared to 86% in 2019. So there was a slight drop-off in registration. I guess this had to do with how many people went back and registered in 2020. Now, I don't know what is accounting for that. If it is true, I think we need to probably understand why is it people probably didn't see the benefit of going back and being registered. Or do they think that they can survive here better being undocumented? I referred to this fact when I discussed Colombia and Peru last time. I pointed to the fact that many of them, before the very liberal move by the Colombian government, many of them preferred to be undocumented, and they got along pretty well. I think it was over 56% undocumented in Colombia, even though they had a 2-year registration program as compared to our 6 months registration program. They had a much greater reason to register. Yet still a lot of them remain unregistered. I think we need to find out a lot more about why this is so, because some people believe that there are about 50,000, 60,000 Venezuelans here, and a large number of them are undocumented and they do not register. And this we can compare to what the surveys themselves said. I think the survey said that more or less 80 to 85% of the persons that they interviewed were registered. So that again here, we know that undocumented people do not come forward in terms of a survey, but to some extent that is indicative of how things may be panning out there. Now, as regards people coming from various parts of Venezuela, I see where we point out where in 2019 more people came from the east, that is in the Delta Macuro area out here, in the Orinoco region. We got a lot more people come in as compared to 2020, where more people came from the west, from let's say further west, probably as far as Caracas, more people came there. Now, I think that is a significant finding if it is true, because it is telling you that probably the country may be becoming a little more attractive for those to the west. It has never been very attractive for those to the west, but if that is true, then we may be seeing some kind of significant change. But I'm hesitant to really draw any conclusions at this point in time because, as I said, a lot of it's very difficult to compare these two surveys. Now, finally, the point about the informal sector, I think Roger touched on this. It seems to me that here we may have a problem of definition of the informal sector. A drop in the informal sector, in the employment in the informal sector. I don't know what really, what does that mean? I think it was dropped to 40-something% as compared to about 60% before. Right throughout Latin America, as you look at Venezuelans employed, you see a large number of them in the informal sector. In Peru, for instance, there's a significant amount. But of course, Peru by itself is a very, it's a larger and informal sector. I think the majority, the largest sector is the informal sector, probably over 50%. I don't know really what to say about our situation. The government defines the informal sector in a slightly different way here. It's something that probably we need to sit down and look at what we are defining as the informal sector. I know Roger has his concept of the informal sector and what he thinks to be, and how it is part of the non-tradable sector and how it operates in such a way to be very attractive for Venezuelan labor. But that is an issue I think we need to trash out, and maybe this information could help us in some way to try to find it out. Now it is clear that, for instance, when you look at where they're employed, that construction, retail, commerce, the hospitality industry, these are the sectors where the bulk of them are. And that is, to me, understandable. But what is interesting, and which I found probably needs a lot more inquiry, is there seems to be, from the second survey, a fair amount of skills which many of us felt did not really exist. I mean, they're showing a significant amount. I think there was about 30% of persons with university degrees, although I think it was said some point later, or not necessarily in this exercise, there's said some later on, that varied with those who registered with the government in 2019. The government found about 10 or 15% of them had university degrees. But this 2020 study is showing that about 30-35% of them have the university's degree. However you look at it, there's a marked increase in education in the second survey. I tried to, for instance, compare the two surveys, even though they use different criteria. But what I did was to say, all of those who had secondary and above, right? And you'd find, for instance, in the second survey, about 85% had secondary and above, which means tech, voc education, university education. Whereas in the first survey, 2019, you'd find that figure to be about 70, probably at most about 75%. So there's some discrepancy there we need to work out. But what is clear is that if you have more educated people, and I think this was one of the conclusions, why is it that they're not being employed in the sectors where you need that level of education? Okay, the informal sector in my view doesn't probably need that level of education, and that level of education could probably fit you into other things in industry and even agriculture and so forth, where we need a lot more brain power because agriculture has to be technology driven. So this is where I will stop here because I realize that I've gone over 6 minutes. We have a lot to really discuss here. There's an interesting observation about food insecurity in 2020. I think that might tally with the trends in the country, given the fact of COVID and the kind of shortages that we may be experiencing now. And I think what is interesting is that in 2020, food insecurity rises to be a priority, which it wasn't in 2019, sorry. And I think that's an interesting observation that we may wish to explore. Well, let me stop there and thank again IOM and Leanne for the presentation. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Professor Gonzales. Next, I'd like to invite Mr. Eric Walcott to give his contribution on this evening's session. Mr. Walcott.
Yes, thanks, Christian. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the invite, and I would like to compliment this group for putting such a worthwhile discussion before us today. And while we are back in Washington, back in the United States, we just want to let everyone know that this is an issue that's near and dear to our hearts. First of all, let me just say that the two speakers that spoke before me, Roger Hussein and I believe Anthony Gonzales, I think really did a very comprehensive job in terms of looking at the IOM report and perhaps raising some issues and teasing out some of the data findings. So I may not go too much into detail in terms of the report, but I'm gonna speak a little bit on some concerns in terms of vulnerable populations and what your data has touched on. And I would probably also just mention a little bit that perhaps one of the things that I would probably like to have seen more is about the migrant populations, and as they are in process to try to get a sense of whether or not they know of other family members that have been so affected and probably are in either Guyana, Suriname, Colombia. And I think and probably try to look at some of the issues of reconnectivity or reconnected families. I think the IOM report can probably look into that a little bit. Now, I will invite Dr. Nyla Lyons to actually come in and share my 6 minutes, because I think she'll speak more on probably in terms of vulnerable populations, maybe children, and the concern about sexually transmitted diseases, HIV and sexually transmitted diseases. Chris, I hope you'll allow me to do that because I think that would be more worthwhile. I just want to also add that I've invited my good friend, Kelis Moreno of Colombia, because she is also, Colombia is also struggling with the migrant populations from Venezuela as well. And I think it will be important to learn from how they are actually managing that situation. One of my good friends, Nelson, who is our responsible party for cybersecurity, one of the concerns he mentioned, for example, is how does Trinidad, for example, deal with its borders as far as opening borders and tracking individuals and sharing security. I didn't think that that was touched on well in terms of what type of information relative to security information. What do we know about the backgrounds about the individuals who are coming into Guyana? I know there have been many claims in terms of the increase in gang activity, whether or not IOM had looked into any data issues that would probably either support that there is an increase in gang members crossing the lines, whether or not there are any nefarious activities around trafficking of arms, whether or not they're taking advantage of the migratory patterns of the vulnerable Venezuelans coming into Trinidad and the implications of that. I will at some point through the discussion also talk about that there are significant diaspora organizations, for example, who are trying to connect with the migrant populations from Venezuela, and the difficulty of doing that, and probably the need to actually try to ascertain whether or not there's a role here for diaspora engagement. So again, I'll stay broadly on that. I've asked also Fermin Bakker of HRA, who's doing some work with IOM on diaspora mobilization, to come on board, just so at some point he'll talk about a little bit how more diaspora can support, particularly in programs like this, where we raise the visibility of this issue through such wonderful studies that have been done, and to try to figure out how a diaspora can support different categories of populations and different areas of vulnerability that you've identified. So with that, I'm just going to ask if, and please bear with me, because at the last minute, I kind of lean on one of our strategic partners, Dr. Nyla Lyons, who's actually in Trinidad, And as I reached out to her, we hadn't spoken in a while, she mentioned that, oh, I'm actually in the process of publishing a piece on this. And so I said, well, take a look at the report and see if you can bring some, valuable comments or input to this discussion. Christian, is that possible to have Dr. Lyons take from there, and then I'll follow up?
Yes, that's fine. We did actually create a space for Dr. Lyons to give her contribution. So, Dr. Lyons? Dr. Lyons, we'd like you to unmute, please. Thank you.
All right. Okay, thank you. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me here this evening. I want to also thank, the panel as well as the IOM. I mean, this data is very rich, and I believe looking at some of the key variables, it's important for us to understand the relationships between these variables. I am going to comment specifically on health, right? And how those relationships interact with those socio-demographic factors that we're seeing. We're seeing changes in the socio-demographics of the 1919 DTM data as well as the 2020. And I'm going to talk about it in light of the $11 billion that came into Trinidad over the last 3 years by a number of international organizations, include USAID, Community Resilience Fund. We had their implementing partner was Democracy International. We have the UNHCR. We had local NGOs on the ground, like Living Waters, all doing very important work. It would be interesting to understand, how this 11 million, US dollars over the last 3 years would have impacted access to education, health. We see a great disparity continuing in the access to health services between 2019 and 2020, and in particular, sexual and reproductive health services. So this is what I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight. So what is my area of focus is health. And the impact of migration on health and access to health services is a critical conversation, given that the overall goal of health, as we know, is to promote and maintain health. So we don't have a situation where it becomes a burden on our health system. We know that with the government registration initiative in 2019, once registered, all migrants had access to free emergency services at the Port of Spain General Hospital, right, and other hospitals. We saw that reflecting in the DTM results, where we saw most migrants accessing health services at public hospitals, emergency centers. But it begs to wonder, with the increase in women of childbearing age that are here and their children, we're looking at primary care services that are not available in a hospital emergency situation, and where do these persons access care? And these are very important dynamics. I will tell you why. When we looked at, so I am part of several networks. I sat with the group of USAID, Democracy International subcommittee through the US Embassy, trying to understand where all these funds went and what were the outcomes of these funds. Now, that is why I'm thinking this data is so critical, because I don't think we had this data to really understand where the gaps were. So in order for us to better utilize money that is coming in, right? Money is coming in, foreign governments are giving us money. We need to understand and use this data. I think that was one of the recommendations, to really understand the gaps and to target services. I was happy to see that between 2019 and 2020, there's more focus on Tobago, right? I mean, there's so much I want to say here tonight, because Tobago, as we know, we have heard, right? There has been a focus on migrants in Tobago, but nobody knows how are they accessing services, so the story continues. But what I would focus on is the current project I'm working on. In 2020, the organization which I'm contracted with, the Medical Research Foundation, received a grant from the University of the West Indies, and received IRB approval to examine the relationships between the needs of Venezuelans and their use of health services and access to HIV testing. And I will talk about a little bit about sexually transmitted infections, which are being left out of this critical discussion. I would just say unofficially, if we do not address sexually transmitted infections, populations who arrive in Trinidad and Tobago and don't have access to testing for sexually transmitted infections, to include HIV, runs the risk of forming bridges to the general population, which is a higher healthcare burden on our country. So while recognizing the needs for education, housing, not enough focus, right, is there to understand HIV, STIs, and the use of services so persons get tested. I'm trying to just draw on some of the important things I saw. So the study that we conducted, we did a cross-sectional survey, very small survey during COVID-19, where we interviewed 300 migrants from Venezuela, asking them about, well, once they consented and, you know, all protocols observed in terms of IRB, asking them about what are their needs? What are their needs for their physical health needs? What are their mental health needs? What is their sexual health needs? And I'm so happy I'm here tonight because a lot of the information presented here really corroborates what we found, that women were 2.8 times as likely to face difficulty accessing health services. Women who needed condoms, who needed a pregnancy test, they went to the pharmacy, right? And of course, when we looked at the socio-demographic and economic factors, it was only those who were able to afford it. So it begs the question, right? So we are dealing with, we're on the verge of something because we found a lot of women, right, childbearing age, within our survey requesting condoms, pregnancy testing, right? We didn't get into, we had about 72% of the population said they had an HIV test within the last 12 months, and most of them accessed these services through the NGOs. So there's a lot of data. The survey is not, let me just say, it is not representative. I heard someone talked about, you know, the data we're looking at and whether it's representative of all migrants. But I think it's in a step in the right direction because we're now able to examine the relationships between the variables. So we can sit here tonight and we can say, okay, the DTM showed us this number of persons accessing services. This number had children, but examining the relationships, right? Looking at the significance of these relationships through regression models, that's what's needed. Using the DTM, as I said, to really create that story and then taking that data and doing some interesting analyses. So we understand, one, who, first of all, are the populations most at risk in terms of their health. I will just give you a little background of Venezuela in terms of their health needs. So when we looked at the situation in Venezuela, there was a very high, the NCDs, right? Diabetes, hypertension. There were very high morbidity and mortality around Venezuelans with NCDs. When we looked at HIV, right? The issue with HIV is that there were over 120,000 Venezuelans living in Venezuela with HIV, but the issue is because of the economic and political strife, there was no access to medications. Not having access to HIV medications and not being virally suppressed and crossing a border and getting pregnant would mean that the virus becomes very much transmissible. We haven't looked at that, but we have looked at the number of women who have accessed HIV testing and what are those factors that determine why they go for an HIV test and what are some of the things, even though it's a cross-sectional study, that we could draw from this. And again, the only reason we're doing this is to better understand the needs, to use the data, to target that $11 million that Trinidad received, and then to look at these international agencies and said, okay, what have we seen, right? What have we seen? We have had money put into NGOs, right? To access, like the Family Planning Association, let me give you an example. They are an NGO in Trinidad doing great work they have set up a bilingual hotline providing psychosocial services for migrants all through COVID. What we don't know is what is the impact of this? Are we seeing a change in the situation in terms of their ability to access services, etc.?
Pardon me, Dr. Naila, I just want to, I know Christian is being gracious, and I know there's a lot you want to share, but we just want to make sure that we stay on the agenda.
All right,
and
thank you.
Christian, there's one more speaker, is that correct? And maybe you could take 2 minutes to just wrap up your thought, but I just wanted to make sure that we're trying to be, in terms of the time.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, so yes, continue, Dr. Lyons. So just a couple of minutes, and then we want to go back to some of our other speakers just to get their thoughts on what has been shared this evening.
Yeah, so I will wrap up because there's so much information. I think I am just trying to cover it all, and I think my area of focus is not just so I'm a medical sociologist, and my particular area of interest is understanding the impact of programs and how we can use the data to address the needs of migrants. So I'm happy to share the abstract for this study with the group. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. We would like that very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Lyons. Okay, so thank you very much to our panelists. Now we just want to go back to Jewel and Leanne. I know Dr. Hussein would have asked some questions.
Hi, Christian, if I may ask something before we continue, please.
Oh, sure, no problem. Dr. Hussein?
Naila, is it possible, you mentioned the abstract of the study, but is it possible you could make a copy available to us, at least to myself and Professor Gonzales?
Well, yes. So it's in the process of being published. I believe I could circulate it internally. That just gives the key highlights of the study. Yes, the paper is actually in the process. Yeah.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
Dr. Hussein, can you repeat, please? You broke up a bit.
Right. Okay. No problem. And the second thing is, you mentioned some 11 million to the university. Are you hearing me?
No, not
Hello?
You're breaking up a bit, Dr. Hussein.
Hello, Christian?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Okay, are you hearing me now?
Yes,
Yes.
I'm hearing you now. Go ahead.
Right. How do we at the university go about accessing some of that funds that you mentioned?
Yeah.
Because there is some really deep work that has to be done on the migrants, in particular linking the migrants to the production possibilities. As I said earlier, I looked at the growth forecast for the Trinidad and Tobago economy, and in every year, we have been among the worst performers, and we need to address this. And maybe if we could chat a bit via WhatsApp or some other means after, but we would be happy to find out how to go about applying for even basic support so we could get some of the macroeconomic work done as relates to the migrant data and the macroeconomic production outcomes.
Yes, so I agree. I am actually mapping the resources that are here and the agencies in the US that are providing those resources, to include our US Embassy. So I'm happy to have a conversation about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Excellent. Okay, so now we'd like to give Leanne and Jewel to address some of the questions put forward by Dr. Hussein.
Okay, thanks so much, Christian. Jewel, would you like to go first on the IRAM related questions, or you would prefer if I start with the survey related questions?
Well, I think you have much more to actually go through. And then I could just sum up, because there are a few things I want to mention, but I think most of the questions were really instrument specific.
Okay, no problem. Thanks for that, Jewel. All right, Dr. Hussein and Dr. Gonzales, Dr. Naila, thanks so much, and Dr. Eric, thanks so much for your contributions and your questions. Very well structured and thought out questions and feedback. So first off, I will begin with Dr. Hussein's questions and comments. And in terms of understanding the difference between refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, what we're seeing in Trinidad is essentially a mixed population. And refugees, in its true sense, refers to individuals who have a well-founded fear of persecution for various reasons, and they are unable to obtain any type of protection in their country of nationality. Hence, they would have gone through the UNHCR or some sort of refugee determination process, and they would have been assessed and deemed to be a refugee through that process. Whereas an asylum seeker is an individual who has submitted a claim for refugee status, and his application has not yet been processed and finalized. So that is the asylum seeker. And while the economic migrants are those who come or migrate for economic reasons. So we're seeing in Trinidad a wide range of migrants. It's a mixed migrant population. And that should help in terms of differentiating between the different categories. Regarding the sample size that was used in 2020 as against the sample size in 2019, yes, it was a much smaller sample size, but we followed IOM's internal agreements and guidelines, because I should have mentioned that DTM is a standardized instrument that is conducted across the region and different countries, and the instrument is also generally standardized. So I know a comment came up in terms of trade, looking at the trade type information. I also heard comments on security, any security issues. So DTM is not an all-encompassing tool that goes into several different realms. It is very specific in terms of what it seeks to obtain information on, because it essentially tries to inform programs and provide very timely information to policymakers and technocrats who are involved in the area of work and migration. So regarding the sample size, we were guided by IOM's framework, because given the COVID situation, it was, we were guided, and many other countries were guided, to actually reduce our sample size. So the sample size that was requested was actually 500, and we lobbied in Trinidad for a larger sample size, because it was through a rigorous standardized sample technique that we determined the sample size. And of course, we had to get it approved by IOM's data specialists. So it's a standardized tool that was used, and the sample size, we were told, is a sufficient sample size, and we tried our utmost best to ensure proper representativeness of the individuals who were captured in the exercise. But of course, we had mobility constraints given the environment that we were operating within. There was also an issue in terms of less single people seeking to stay here, and therefore, in less single people in 2020 as opposed to 2019, we had more single people, and now we're seeing a lot more families coming in. And yes, the families coming in, that was a bit of a conflict, because we're seeing families coming in, but at the same time, persons are saying, 53% I think said that they didn't want to stay in Trinidad indefinitely. They plan to return to Venezuela. Regarding now the educated migrants and the inconsistencies as it pertains to the sample and the baseline interviews. So we're noting within the sample that persons indicated that they had, many of them in 2020 indicated that they had university level education, whereas in the information from the government registration process, we're seeing from their side, 73% of the respondents had only secondary level education, and many of them had not completed that secondary level education. So that was certainly a conflict, And no, IOM did not have access to the government registration database while we were doing DTM, but we did engage stakeholders and they were able to speak to the data as it existed. So we didn't have access to the sampling frame from that, or to use a sampling frame possibly from that exercise, or to get detailed information from the registration exercise. So that inconsistency was noted. And I think definitely in terms of a registration exercise, they would have had measures to verify the validity of the academic and educational levels of the persons that were registered. So I think their data and what we found was a bit of a conflict indeed. In terms of the 42% of the persons who came in unofficially, and we're seeing a decrease essentially from 2019 in terms of unofficial entries. And Dr. Hussein asked, how did this, what caused this fall, given that we had border closures and we also had the visa requirements instituted? And if we recall from the sample, we're seeing that the majority of our respondents were in Trinidad over a year, over 12 months, which means that they would have been in the country prior to the border restrictions, prior to the visa restrictions. So they would have been reporting on a time where these restrictions did not apply. So that may be able to explain what we saw here. And yes, given that many of them came in 2019, it would mean that we did not capture a number of persons, or well, persons, I can't say a number because we're not sure of the numbers, but we did not capture significant numbers of persons who came in after 2019. So that is definitely something that we see within the data. In terms of the fall in the unemployment within the formal sector, so the increase of unemployment within the formal sector, Dr. Hussein spoke to that, and he was also indicating that it could have been a decrease in the informal sector as it relates to unemployment. So the DTM, as I indicated, is a standardized tool, and we are somewhat limited in terms of the amount of tweaks or questions that we can add. As a matter of fact, whilst we wanted to retain, and we did actually succeed in retaining substantial amount of questions in DTM 2020, as well as introducing new sections. But so there are certain core questions we try to retain, of course, for comparability purposes. But we still have to operate within the framework, the wider framework of the IOM organization to ensure regional comparability. And actually some countries had much shorter questionnaires than ours. So we were happy that we were still allowed to retain those core elements as well as introduce some additional ones. The educational issue regarding children and their accessibility. We're seeing a decrease in the number of children, or the percentage of children living with respondents who had no access to education. And one possible reason here could be, and I know Joel could speak to this a little bit more, is that there are some NGOs in Trinidad and Tobago that are offering educational services to Venezuelan migrant children in a private-based capacity, as well as they are also offering courses based on the Venezuelan system to persons or migrant children in Trinidad. So that's something Joel can definitely expand on in her contribution. Regarding the implications for trade and the labor market, as I indicated, the DTM does not specifically inform on those areas, but it does highlight certain bits of data that could encourage additional research in those areas as it pertains to the skills that the individuals are possess, the trainings that they're interested in, their capacity to receive training, you know, all of those things definitely are encouraging elements that could inform additional research. Dr. Hussein, you can let me know if I captured all of your questions. If not, at the end, you can always reiterate some if I missed any. Regarding Dr. Gonzales' contributions, yes, I indicated that we did not have access to the government's sampling frame, and that is definitely an issue in terms of doing any type of survey or research on the migrant population, especially given the current climate, as some migrants were registered, some migrants were not registered. We do not have a defined frame. So it is a bit of a challenge, and we work within the realm of what we have control over. And yes, we'll definitely be interested in working alongside you to develop, you know, additional techniques for increasing representativeness given the approach to the sampling that we currently use. Additionally, you indicated that there were some changes in sex, as well as the stratification, the geographic spread of the respondents, and we see that indeed in our findings, as well as the persons who were registered. A drop-off in registration wasn't necessarily a drop-off in registration between 2019 and 2020. It was just in terms of the respondents that we captured, and those who were part of the 2019 registration exercise as opposed to those who were not. Because DTM was conducted in 2020, so we would not have captured those who would have participated in the 2021 re-registration exercise. Apart from this, I have to note that the 2020 and 2019 DTM findings both indicated that the majority of respondents came from the eastern side of Venezuela. So that's just something to note. And we definitely see that there has been a number of areas, that DTM has raised, and you know, that is the beauty of DTM. It is wide in terms of the areas that it captures information on, different thematic areas, but it provides us now with a base to expand, you know, get into more direct and focused research that would produce more rigorous or academic-based papers on different thematic areas that we would have spoken to or identified in the DTM exercise. Regarding Dr. Eric's contributions, so I indicated DTM doesn't cover security issues within its current remit, and you asked whether there's significant opportunities for diaspora engagement, and that's something I know Jewel will definitely speak to. And finally, in terms of the disparity in access, I know Dr. Naila would have spoken about that, the disparity in access to sexual and reproductive services. The way the question was posed, it was, did you access? So it wasn't in terms of them not having access, it was, did you access, did you seek out or engage any type of services of this nature? And those were the findings we noted in terms of many of them not having access, or not really not having access, but not accessing these services. Additionally, I must also highlight that primary health care in Trinidad and Tobago is available for all persons, irregardless of their migrant status. Whereas, you know, I think I heard somewhere in the contributions that there were challenges in migrants accessing primary health care. And we're seeing in the DTM 71% of the respondents actually accessed services from the public hospitals. So I think definitely the DTM has generated a lot of useful discussion, and it's now an opportunity for us to engage it in a more detailed way to produce focused research based on the concerns that we identified in this exercise. I hope I answered all of your questions. If not, you can let me know and I will address them. Jewel, I don't know if you want to jump in or we'll wait to find out.
Certainly, thanks, Leanne, for your points. I wanted to really address an overall issue. One of the key things back in 2018, I believe, when the UN declared the situation in Venezuela as a level 2 emergency, as well as surrounding countries who were receiving flows. Later on, the Secretary General then he basically asked for an interagency coordination mechanism to be established from the UN side. And this interagency mechanism is co-chaired by IOM and UNHCR. And I say all of this as an introduction as to what are we doing with the 11+ million in Trinidad. We actually have a website, R4V, and I would share it on the chat. And there you could actually see everything from our monthly sit-reps. So for instance, throughout all the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean affected by the flows of Venezuelans, we have set up coordination mechanisms at a national level. So for instance, in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a coordination mechanism, a national platform for all the agencies working on the Venezuela response. It's made up of the UN agencies, implementing partners, international partners, and even government. So this is set up in each country across Latin America and Caribbean. Apart from the national platforms, we also have sub-working groups. So we have sub-working group on protection, we have sub-working groups on child protection, we have on detention and deportation, sub-working groups, education. And on our website, you could see, because we are required through this coordination mechanisms as agencies responding to the crisis to actually do monthly reports, and we are expected to have disaggregated information. So there's already a lot of information out there. If you go to our R4V website, which I will share in the chat, you could see our sit-reps. We have things such as country fact sheets and other types of information. And apart from that, what we did in 2020 and 2021, we developed what we call our regional refugee and migrants response plan. And that gives an overarching strategic view of what has been going on with the Venezuelan response, but it's also used as it's a strategic plan that identifies key priorities, key gaps and all of that, but it's also a way of mobilizing resources. And through these coordination mechanisms that exist at the national level, which then report to the regional level, Panama is where all of us report to, resources are generated from several different donors through that mechanism. And so everything that we do in terms of the Venezuelan response, not just for US government funding, but for all different donor fundings, is all online. In terms of whether the DTM, Leanne already mentioned that the DTM is a standardized technique. And we use DTM in conjunction with our other data collection methods at the office, which Leanne would have briefly mentioned in her presentation. But apart from IOM, there are other agencies within the response who also collect data. And all of this data, again, some of these assessments are public document and you can access them on the website. What is key is that IOM is definitely interested in moving beyond DTM. DTM, of course, is focused on, informing our programs and projects, but we need sometimes to delve a little deeper. There were so many questions and requests, and this is exactly what DTM is about. Now we could give an idea. DTM is also used as an emergency tool. So you have to understand that DTM is an exercise that is conducted under a very short space of time. They are in the field literally for a few weeks. And the idea is that DTM is also conducted in rounds so that you get an idea of what is changing, over time. But it does not take away from the fact that you need to have deeper academic analysis. And IOM is definitely interested in exploring those type of possibilities. And we could speak bilaterally in terms of our plans for the coming year. What another thing in terms of, there was a lot of call about, where are the best practices and all of that, and how can that be shared at a local level. Apart from the Alpha-V platform, which we already document a lot of that, IOM also has, different spaces for dialogue. We have the regional consultative process, which is basically an informal way that countries across the world will meet and discuss migration issues in a non-binding, non-threatening way. We have been working with UNICEF for several years to try to set up something similar in the Caribbean, which is the only region in the world that does not have a regional consultative process going. And even though it's non-binding, migration always tends to be, very contentious, sensitive type issues, because IOM believes that because it's non-binding, it has been extremely successful as being a space where governments can come together and discuss things, and it has actually led to formalized responses. And apart from the RCP, I also wanted to mention we do have upcoming a regional review of the Global Compact on migration I think it's in April, very soon. And this is another place where government and the entire Venezuelan flows will be featured. In terms of the education topic, there are agencies who are involved with assisting refugee and migrant children. UNICEF and UNHCR have partnered to actually do what they call as, I believe they call them equal spaces, but basically a place that migrant children can access education. Of course, they are not able, due to resources, unable to provide for all migrant children, but they have been making, some dents in terms of providing for some. Apart from that, we do have the Trinidad and Tobago Venezuela Solidarity Network, and they have been providing online education for secondary school children. But I would really like to employ that we really go to a lot of the questions that you have about what is going on, particularly about what UN agencies are doing with the Venezuelan response. A lot of that actually already exists online, and we would share the links to that. I think those were the main points that I wanted to raise. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, hi, Joel. May I just ask, as far as funding, I think someone had mentioned, accessing funding. I think you would be an excellent resource in that area to know which agencies and where UE, given the scope of the studies they want to do, can access funding. So I just wanted to make that link as well. Thank you.
Oh, definitely, because the national platform, all the agencies meet, like today we had our monthly meeting, and this is where we share information on exactly what each agency is doing or planning to do to avoid the duplication. And as I said, our entire plan, it is a plan, but it's also a resource mobilizing tool. So we use our data, our DTM, our assessments, and then try to project forward. And then when, as all the agencies under the platform, we would then host donor conferences, and they could see that this is a plan that the entire coordination mechanism has for the region. It has by country, it has by say the sub-region of the Caribbean. So yeah, we could definitely have further discussions about the actual funding and how that works.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Jewel. Yeah, Eric?
Sorry, I apologize. I wanted to just follow up on a question to Jewel. Is that possible, or?
Okay, yes, I will give you the opportunity, but just one moment. So everybody, we just want to give you the opportunity to make your closing remarks. And Mr. Walcott, I will give you the opportunity in your closing remarks to address it. So I'll let Jewel come back and address. So I'd like to begin with Dr. Lyons, so she can give her closing remarks. Dr. Lyons.
All right, sorry about that. So my closing remarks, thank you once again. I think this was forum to bring together persons who obviously we are seeing the synergies already. And I think that someone mentioned that even though the data is where it is, it can help us to continue to look at how we can continue to map the services, identify what are the greatest needs. And I'm really appreciative of meeting persons here and being able to be part of this project. This discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Walcott.
Hi, sorry. So again, I think I'm very impressed with the presenters and Jewel and Leon. I do believe from Jewel, in terms of the presentation, I'm understanding that you're in place the UN cluster system. And so my question would have been that perhaps if UA is not fully integrated in that cluster disaster response system, then perhaps there might be an opportunity for them to be included. Part of the challenges we've also seen is that the civil society is not fully integrated in the cluster response. And so some of the challenges and barriers to accessing the target population can be mitigated through having some of the civil society, some of the NGOs involved. And so this is something that I would ask of you, that there may be some additional, as you lean forward, reaching out to civil society. I also wanted to mention that the information on pregnant women, and although it seemed as if that there was a reduction from 2019 to 20, I would just also be interested in the tracking all of those women from the prenatal period to birth. And finally, in terms of diaspora engagement, we need to figure out if there is a role and what is the proper mechanism, and if there are also opportunities to link families across borders, across different boundaries, particularly more in terms of the interconnectivity between some of the other countries where you see flow of migrant populations from Venezuela, where there's more communication between Suriname, Guyana, Colombia, to name, and Trinidad. I think this would be of special interest. And the Institute of Caribbean Studies back in Washington would certainly like to continue to work with Christian and the rest of the group in terms of bringing some visibility to the issue, continue to make sure that US is a robust and a significant partner. And whatever we can do, whether it be creating opportunities to engage some of our legislators on the Hill, who are in fact very concerned, and to at some point probably try to, if they have not been or hasn't been one yet, a congressional delegation to come down and visit. I think there might be some opportunity to do that. So thank you very much for this opportunity. This has been a very worthwhile and very good presentation. I look forward to sharing more of the data, the DTM, and look forward to continue to stay engaged with Christian and the rest of the group. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mr. Walcott. Professor Gonzales, we'd just like to encourage you to give your closing remarks.
Yes, thank you, Christian. I'll be very brief. I think that the exercise was very useful in that I think we were able to demarcate the limitations of what we have so far. I think it was clear to me that from all the speakers that I've heard, that we need to begin to see how we understand better what is in front of us. And that is to say, how we do improve surveys in the future. For instance, Leanne raised the question of the access to the government registered list as a sampling frame, for instance. Is not something that we could try to advocate for or try to access in some way. How do we build that sampling frame? How do we get a proper consensus of the Venezuelans and know a bit more how they are geographically located? To me, that is key in terms of getting some kind of representative outlook and among them, and for us to be able to trace from year to year what is happening among them. And a lot of interesting observations were made. I think they are useful in some way, though we understand the limitations, and I believe that we can take them forward in terms of how we define the future and seek to increase our knowledge about Venezuelan migrants here. I would also say in closing that this seminar has opened up tremendous possibilities for collaborative work. I think a number of us who are in this area are coming at this from different angles, and I think, as someone pointed out, the synergies are there, and we need to probably sit down and look at them and see how we could improve things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gonzales. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Hussein to give his closing remarks. Dr. Hussein.
So, thank you very much all. The survey work and the presentation by the IOM was really very much appreciated. It raised a lot of questions. There are still, as Joel and Leanne could appreciate, especially in an audience like this, there are still some questions that we would like to see answered. But what you all have provided is a valuable starting point, and that will go a long way, and we will refer to this study several times in the future. I think a critical gap that, and Eric spoke to it and Professor Gonzales spoke to it, that is missing is relating the survey and bringing the survey material now to life. I mean, at the end of the day, it really bothers me when I look at the Trinidad and Tobago economy in particular, and I almost see the only factor of production that has some fire, that has some booming attributes in it, being wasted. That's the way I see it. And you know, some of the students that I see on here would understand that there is a Rebezinski effect at play here that we should capitalize on, and we are nowhere near that because we don't have the material. And whilst we cannot force the powers that be to register all the Venezuelans, what we can do is put the facts in the public domain and let them see if it is of any use and how they could possibly use this information for the betterment of Trinidad and Tobago. Certainly, some of the people that commented, we would definitely be following up with Eric and Naila and Joel as to how we could move from this one segment of a whole towards producing, and Professor Gonzales summarized it well, a more cohesive response with much more moving parts on such a valuable, important aspect at a challenging time in the developmental trajectory of our country. So I really, really appreciated the conversation. The presentation by Leanne was smooth and fluid. The conversation by the other participants very useful. And what I liked is it built strongly on the very, very sophisticated presentation that Professor Gonzales gave the last time around. and we need to keep these interactions going forward. So we will stop there. Some of you all, we definitely would be reaching out to for our next iteration in 2 weeks' time. We would go away and do our homework and get back to you all. But thank you very much for the time and for the learnings that you all presented.
Thank you very much for your closing remarks, Dr. Hussein. Leanne and Jewel, do you have anything else that you would like to add? Any main takeaways that you would like to add before we close?
I would just want to say that, you know, from IOM's perspective generally, registration is encouraged for all irregular migrants, and we're not talking not just Venezuelans, all migrants. That is always like the general recommendation. I wanted to say to Mr. Walcott that diaspora engagement is already being considered, and we are already engaging Aruba, Curacao, and Guyana, already countries in the Caribbean seriously affected by the Venezuelan flows, and they as well have national platforms set up. And thank you, Mr. Walcott, for saying it even better than I can. The best suggestion is really for the university to be incorporated. When it's not a cluster, but it's very similar. We're piloting a different type of coordination mechanism. So the best advice is really to be incorporated within our R4V platform and our regional response to Venezuela. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your closing remarks. Leanne?
Okay, just in closing, briefly, thanks again for the opportunity to share the findings of the DTM with this esteemed group. And I want to reiterate, yes, we all have different areas that we're interested in, and you know that extends to the wider community as well. But we need to see things in a more holistic way, whereby we cannot just see it narrowly in the sense of what our areas require, but it needs to be done in a more strategic approach, whereby we have like a migration policy based on labor gaps and assessments that can give us even more direction in terms of what do we require in our country, and then develop a migration policy based on that. And then labor migration will be a subset of that wider migration policy. So I just wanted to highlight that, you know, in moving forward with our discussions and stuff, that's certainly something we need to advocate for. And I know that some work is underway. IOM assisted with the development of a draft labor migration policy, and there may be some upcoming work with a wider migration policy, but we need to see things, you know, in a broader context to really ensure that we have a holistic approach to addressing the migrants as well as our national needs. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Leanne. So to all of our panelists, thank you very much for your contributions. We have really had a truly engaging discussion around the presentation of some very rich data. We appreciate you taking your time to join us. And for our audience, we thank you very much for joining us today. I just want to tell you to stay safe. Please wear your masks. If the opportunity to get vaccinated does come up, please do so. And we'd just like to wish you all a good night.